The hum of the airport terminal buzzed faintly in the background as Serena Jackson adjusted the strap of her handbag. To anyone passing by, she might have seemed like any other traveler dressed in understated gray slacks and a light coat. Her hair neatly styled, her demeanor calm. Nothing about her appearance hinted at the extraordinary life she led, the boardrooms she commanded, the companies she had built, or the philanthropic efforts that spanned continents. Serena had always believed in letting her actions speak louder than her possessions. Stepping into the first-class cabin of the aircraft, she allowed herself a rare moment of anticipation. It had been a long day, filled with meetings that demanded both precision and patience. The spacious seats and quiet ambiance of first class promised a brief respite. A chance to reflect on the progress of a new initiative she had funded to bring clean water to underserved communities. She located her seat near the window, carefully placing her bag in the overhead compartment. As she settled in, Serena noticed the faint but familiar stir of unease around her, a shift in posture, a sidelong glance, the way some passengers seemed to regard her with curiosity or discomfort. It wasn't new to her. She had seen it in hotel lobbies, high-end boutiques, and corporate meetings. The unspoken question lingered in their eyes. What is she doing here? Serena sighed softly, opening the book she had brought along. The words on the page blurred slightly as her thoughts drifted. She had learned long ago to steel herself against such microaggressions, to navigate the spaces where she was both unseen and overly scrutinized. But today, she was tired, and the weight of constant vigilance pressed heavily on her. The flight attendant appeared moments later, her polished uniform and practiced smile the hallmarks of professionalism. "Excuse me, ma'am," the woman said, her tone sharp enough to cut through the calm Serena had been trying to cultivate. "I think you might be in the wrong section. Economy seating is further back." Serena looked up, her expression neutral. She held the woman's gaze for a moment before replying evenly. "This is my seat." The attendant's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of doubt and something else, something less kind. She glanced at the ticket Serena offered, her eyes scanning it with a scrutiny that bordered on suspicion. The interaction lasted only seconds, but it felt far longer. When the attendant finally returned the ticket, her voice carried a clipped edge. "Very well," she said, though her demeanor suggested she remained unconvinced. "Enjoy your flight." Serena's grip tightened on the book in her hands, her calm exterior concealing the sting of the encounter. She had experienced this before. The quiet indignities that came not from overt hostility but from the subtle yet unmistakable assertion that she did not belong. As the plane filled with passengers, Serena turned her gaze to the window, focusing on the tarmac below. She thought about the long road that had brought her here. Not just to this flight but to the place she now occupied in life. There had been hurdles, some almost insurmountable, but she had always pushed forward. Yet no amount of success could shield her from moments like these. Moments that reminded her of how deeply ingrained some divides remained. A low murmur of conversation rose around her as the cabin filled. Serena noticed the way the flight attendant interacted with other passengers, warm, deferential, a far cry from the cool reception she herself had received. The contrast wasn't lost on her, nor was it unfamiliar. Her wealth and status had not erased the assumptions others made based on the color of her skin. Instead, it had placed her in a liminal space, where she was both highly visible and persistently questioned. The tension simmered quietly, unnoticed by most, until it escalated. The flight attendant returned, this time accompanied by the pilot. He was a middle-aged man with a square jaw and a no-nonsense air, his uniform pristine and his expression unreadable. "Ma'am," he began, his tone firm but impersonal. "We've received concerns about your seating. Can I see your ticket, please?" Serena handed it over without a word, her movements measured. The pilot examined it briefly before handing it back. "Everything seems to be in order," he said, though his voice lacked the warmth of an apology. "We're just trying to ensure everyone is in the correct section." The implication hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Serena nodded, offering no further explanation. She had no intention of justifying her presence or defending her worth. As the pilot and attendant moved away, Serena felt the weight of the states from other passengers. Some looked on with mild curiosity, others with discomfort. No one said anything. The silence was as much a part of the experience as the confrontation itself. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Serena leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes. The incident replayed in her mind. Not with anger but with a sense of resignation. It was a reminder of the work that still needed to be done. Of the barriers that remained even in spaces that prided themselves on exclusivity and comfort. She thought of the people she worked tirelessly to uplift, communities that faced challenges far greater than a dismissive flight attendant or a skeptical pilot. And she thought of the power she wielded. The resources and influence she could use to challenge the systems that allowed such biases to persist. By the time the plane lifted off the ground, Serena had resolved not to let the incident pass unnoticed. This wasn't just about her. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to endure the quiet indignities she had faced. For Serena Jackson, the journey had only just begun. The evening air was heavy with a quiet stillness as Serena Jackson sat alone in the airport lounge. Through the tall glass windows, the orange glow of the setting sun cast long shadows across the tarmac, bathing the planes in a soft, amber light. The noise of the bustling airport seemed distant here, muted by the plush carpets and the understated luxury of the space. Serena sipped her tea, its warmth a small comfort against the chill of the day's events. The slap of the pilot's hand, though fleeting, had left a sting, not just on her cheek but on her spirit. Yet it wasn't the physical pain that lingered. What weighed on her now was the humiliation, the public display of judgment, and the unspoken accusation that her very presence in first class was somehow illegitimate. She had faced prejudice before, of course. It had followed her from her early days as a young entrepreneur to her current position as one of the most influential women in the business world. But this incident felt different. It was so blatant, so deliberate, that it left her questioning the depth of the biases that still permeated spaces that should have been neutral. Serena's phone vibrated softly, interrupting her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from her assistant, Carla, checking on her whereabouts. Serena hesitated before typing back, "I'll be home late." Something came up. She didn't want to explain yet. Not until she had sorted through the tangle of emotions and decisions swirling in her mind. Later, as she sat in her car, being driven home, Serena allowed herself to replay the incident. She thought of the flight attendant's curt tone, the pilot's dismissive glare, and the stunned silence of the passengers who had watched without intervening. It was all so painfully familiar. The way some people felt entitled to decide who belonged and who didn't, based on little more than appearances. Her mind drifted to the passengers in first class. She remembered their sideways glances, the way they had avoided eye contact as if distancing themselves from the confrontation. It wasn't their silence that bothered her most, but the ease with which they had accepted what was happening. Their complacency was the quiet reinforcement of the divide, a subtle yet powerful reminder of the societal norms that still allowed such behavior to thrive. Serena closed her eyes and leaned back against the leather seat. She had built a life on resilience, on proving people wrong, but even she felt the weight of moments like this. For every step forward, there seemed to be a reminder of how far there was still to go. By the time she arrived home, Serena had begun to shift her focus. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could control what came next. She wasn't a victim of circumstance. She was a woman of action. Someone who had built her empire by refusing to be confined by others' expectations. Her first call was to her legal team. She relayed the events of the day with calm precision, detailing the actions of both the flight attendant and the pilot. Her voice was steady, but her words carried the weight of someone who understood the implications of what had happened. "I don't want this to be about revenge," she said firmly. "I want accountability. I want transparency. And more than that, I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Her lawyers assured her they would begin gathering evidence immediately. Witness statements, security footage, and airline policies would all be reviewed. Serena thanked them and hung up, feeling a flicker of satisfaction. This wasn't about a single incident. It was about addressing a culture that allowed such incidents to occur. The next morning, Serena met with her executive team. As the owner of the airline, she had a unique position. Not just to demand accountability but to lead by example. She listened as her team updated her on the initial steps of the investigation. Passengers from the flight were being contacted, and internal records of the flight crew's behavior were being reviewed. "We've had complaints about the flight attendant before," one of her managers admitted hesitantly. "Nothing this serious, but there's a pattern of questionable behavior." Serena's lips pressed into a thin line. "And what about the pilot?" "Nothing formal, but there are whispers," the manager said carefully. "He has a reputation for being authoritative." Serena nodded, absorbing the information. It wasn't enough to deal with the individuals involved. She needed to address the broader culture that allowed such behavior to persist. That would require more than disciplinary action, it would require systemic change. By the afternoon, news of the incident had begun to spread. Videos taken by passengers had surfaced online, showing the heated exchange between Serena and the flight attendant. The footage didn't capture the slap, but it showed the escalating tension, the subtle but undeniable bias in the flight crew's behavior. The public response was swift and divided. Some viewers expressed outrage, condemning the treatment Serena had endured. Others defended the crew, suggesting that Serena had overreacted or misinterpreted the situation. The comments were a stark reminder of the deeply ingrained prejudices that shaped such discussions. Serena watched the coverage from her office, her expression unreadable. She didn't need public sympathy or outrage. What she needed was for this to be a turning point. Not just for her airline but for the industry as a whole. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting her office in shadow, Serena made another call. This time, it was to her public relations team. "We need to control the narrative," she said. "This isn't about me. It's about a culture that needs to change. Let's focus on that." Her team agreed, and plans were set in motion. A press release would be issued, acknowledging the incident and outlining the steps being taken to address it. Training programs on cultural sensitivity and anti-discrimination would be developed and implemented across the airline. That night, as Serena sat alone in her quiet home, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The day had been exhausting, but it had also been clarifying. She understood now that this wasn't just a personal battle. It was an opportunity to challenge the status quo. To create a system where fairness and respect were not just ideals but realities. As she gazed out at the city lights, Serena felt a sense of calm determination settle over her. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was one she was prepared to walk. Tomorrow, the real work will begin. Morning light spilled through the large windows of Serena Jackson's office, casting a warm glow on the polished wooden desk and the neat stacks of documents spread across its surface. Outside, the city hummed with the rhythm of a new day. But inside, Serena's focus was fixed on the conversation unfolding before her. Her legal team had convened for an update on the internal investigation. Gathered around the conference table, the team exuded an air of professionalism, though Serena could sense the underlying tension in their voices. The events on the plane had sparked a firestorm of scrutiny. Not just within the airline but also from the public. For Serena, the stakes were far greater than managing a public relations crisis. This was about systemic accountability. "We've interviewed several passengers from the flight," one of the lawyers began, flipping through a binder of notes. "Most of them corroborate your account. They observed the flight attendant's hostility and the pilot's unnecessary escalation of the situation. A few even mentioned feeling uncomfortable with how the crew seemed to single you out." Serena nodded, her expression calm but her mind working quickly. "And the employees?" she asked. The lawyer hesitated. "It's more complicated. Some of their colleagues are reluctant to speak openly. But we've found patterns. Bethany, the flight attendant, has had several complaints filed against her. Most of them were dismissed as minor incidents, rudeness, inattentiveness. But there's a pattern of targeting passengers who are women of color." The words hung in the air, heavy but not surprising. Serena had suspected as much. The systemic nature of bias often revealed itself in small, seemingly inconsequential moments that, when examined collectively, painted a damning picture. "What about the pilot?" Serena pressed. The lawyer exchanged a glance with a colleague before answering. "William has fewer documented complaints. But there are reports of a domineering attitude. Several employees mentioned feeling intimidated by him. It's not explicit, But it's clear he's fostered an environment where questioning his authority is discouraged. Serena leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. The pieces were falling into place. And they told a story she knew all too well. One where power and prejudice intertwined to create an atmosphere that allowed microaggressions and outright discrimination to go unchecked. Later that day, Serena walked the halls of the airline's headquarters. The modern building, with its sleek design and bustling corridors, felt oddly disconnected from the deeper issues it housed. As she passed groups of employees, she noticed the way some conversations quieted as she approached. The way certain glances lingered. The incident on the plane had rippled through the company, sparking hushed discussions and uneasy speculation. Serena didn't mind the whispers. In fact, she welcomed them. Change often began with discomfort, and the tension in the air was a sign that people were starting to pay attention. She stopped by the training department, where a team was already drafting plans for a comprehensive cultural sensitivity program. The head of the department, a woman named Diane, greeted Serena with a firm handshake and a stack of preliminary materials. "We've started designing modules focused on implicit bias, customer service ethics, and crisis de-escalation," Diane explained. "The idea is to make these sessions mandatory for all employees, from frontline staff to senior leadership." Serena flipped through the materials, nodding thoughtfully. "This is a good start," she said, "but it's not enough. The training needs to go beyond compliance. It has to challenge the way people think, the assumptions they make without realizing it." Diane hesitated before responding. "That's a tall order. Changing attitudes is much harder than changing policies." "I know," Serena said, her voice steady, "but it's necessary. If we don't address the mindset behind the behavior, we're just treating symptoms, not the cause." Meanwhile, Bethany and William were beginning to feel the weight of the investigation. For Bethany, the scrutiny was unnerving. She had always prided herself on her professionalism, but now she was being asked to confront a side of herself she preferred not to acknowledge. The complaints against her, dismissed so easily in the past, now loomed like accusations she couldn't escape. In private, Bethany insisted to her friends that the incident had been blown out of proportion. "I was just doing my job," she said, her voice defensive. "I didn't mean anything by it." But late at night, when the noise of the day faded, she found herself replaying the confrontation in her mind. She remembered Serena's calm defiance, the way her words had cut through the tension with quiet strength. For the first time, Bethany began to wonder if her actions had been shaped by something deeper, something she didn't want to admit. William, on the other hand, was outwardly unfazed. As a senior pilot, he was used to authority and control. The idea that he had acted improperly seemed absurd to him. Yet, as the investigation progressed, he found himself increasingly isolated. Colleagues who once admired him now kept their distance, and the once familiar rhythm of his work life felt suddenly uncertain. In the solitude of his office, William reviewed the airline's policies on passenger interactions. For the first time, he noticed the gaps. The lack of guidance on addressing implicit bias, the absence of protocols for de-escalating tense situations. He didn't want to admit it, but a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that perhaps he had mishandled the incident. Back in her office, Serena reflected on the day's progress. The investigation was uncovering uncomfortable truths, but she knew that exposing problems was only the first step. The real challenge lay in fixing them, in building a culture where fairness and respect weren't exceptions but expectations. As she looked out at the city skyline, Serena thought about the countless people who had faced similar treatment, who didn't have the resources or platform to fight back. She couldn't change the past, but she could use this moment to create a better future. This wasn't just about an airline. It was about a society where assumptions ran deep, where the quiet divides often went unspoken but never unnoticed. Serena knew the road ahead would be long, but she was ready to walk it, with patience, with purpose, and with the quiet determination of someone who had faced countless battles and emerged stronger every time. The next few days unfolded with a peculiar stillness at the airline's headquarters. The usual hum of activity persisted. Meetings were held, schedules reviewed, and calls answered. But beneath the surface, a quiet tension lingered. The investigation into the incident on Serena Jackson's flight had become the undercurrent of every hallway conversation. Every cautious glance exchanged between colleagues. For Serena, the days were consumed with meetings and updates. She maintained her calm demeanor, though her focus never wavered. This was no longer about a singular moment of disrespect but about uncovering the patterns that allowed such behavior to thrive unchecked. Bethany sat in the break room, a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. She had just come from her first cultural sensitivity training session, and the weight of it sat heavily on her chest. The facilitator had spoken about unconscious bias. The subtle, often unintentional ways in which assumptions shaped behavior. Bethany replayed her interaction with Serena in her mind. At the time, it had seemed routine. Just another day enforcing policies, ensuring order in her cabin. But now, the edges of her memory felt sharper, more defined. She recalled the tone of her voice, the rigidity of her stance, the way she had scrutinized Serena's ticket as though searching for evidence to confirm her own doubts. Her thoughts were interrupted by a colleague entering the room, their face etched with concern. "Tough day?" they asked, settling into a chair across from her. Bethany hesitated before nodding. "This whole thing, it's made me question a lot," she admitted. "I didn't think of myself as someone who would act unfairly. But looking back, I'm not so sure." The colleague offered a sympathetic smile. "It's not easy to face. But maybe that's the point, it's about learning. Not just for you, but for all of us." Across the building, William sat in his office, staring at his computer screen. His inbox was filled with notices, mandatory training sessions, requests for feedback, updates on the investigation. For a man who prided himself on control, the current situation felt like uncharted territory. The role-playing exercise from his own training session lingered in his mind. In one scenario, he had been asked to imagine himself as a passenger experiencing subtle discrimination, being overlooked by a server, receiving curt replies while others were greeted warmly. It had been a simple exercise, but it unsettled him. The discomfort he felt in those moments was fleeting. Yet it offered a glimpse into what Serena must have endured, not just on the flight but perhaps throughout her life. William leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He had dismissed the incident at first, believing it to be an overreaction. But now, as the layers of his own assumptions were peeled back, he began to wonder if he had been too quick to judge, too entrenched in his own authority to see the harm he had caused. Meanwhile, Serena reviewed the first batch of feedback from the training sessions. The reports were mixed. Some employees embraced the lessons, while others resisted, viewing the sessions as unnecessary or overly critical. Serena wasn't surprised. Change rarely came without resistance. And the deeper the roots of the problem, the harder it was to pull them free. One report stood out to her, a reflection written by an employee who admitted to struggling with the concept of bias. "I never thought of myself as prejudiced," the report read, "but this training made me realize it's not about overt actions. It's about the small choices we make every day. The tone of voice we use, the assumptions we carry without even realizing it." Serena set the report down, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. It wasn't much, but it was a start. In the days that followed, the airline began implementing broader changes. A new reporting system for customer complaints was introduced, designed to ensure that every issue was addressed with transparency and fairness. Employees were encouraged to share their experiences anonymously, creating a space where concerns could be voiced without fear of retaliation. At the same time, Serena's team worked to revise the company's policies, embedding the principles of equity and respect into every level of operation. From hiring practices to customer interactions, the goal was to create a culture where fairness wasn't just a checkbox but a fundamental value. One afternoon, Serena received an unexpected visitor. Diane, the head of the training department, entered her office with a folder in hand. "I thought you might want to see this," she said, placing the folder on Serena's desk. Inside were notes from a recent training session, including comments from Bethany and William. Serena read them carefully, her expression thoughtful. Bethany had written, "I realize now that my actions weren't just about enforcing rules. They were about enforcing my own assumptions about who belongs where. That's a hard truth to face. But I want to do better. William's note was shorter but no less significant. I've spent years thinking my authority was enough to justify my decisions. Now I see that authority comes with responsibility. Not just to lead, but to listen. Serena closed the folder and looked up at Diane. Thank you, she said quietly. This means more than you know. That evening, as Serena left the office, she paused to watch the sunset. The sky was streaked with shades of gold and orange, a reminder that even the most turbulent days could end in beauty. She thought of Bethany and William, of the employees grappling with their own biases, and of the passengers who had silently witnessed her ordeal. The road ahead was still long, but Serena felt a quiet sense of hope. Change was never easy, but it was possible. And it started with moments like these, where the cracks in the system allowed the light to seep through. The first chill of autumn was settling over the city, and the early morning air carried a faint crispness that hinted at the changing season. Inside Serena Jackson's office, the atmosphere mirrored the quiet transformation outside, subtle yet undeniable. The investigation was progressing steadily, and Serena was beginning to see the contours of something she hadn't dared to hope for: change. The reports from her team were filled with details, facts, timelines, statements. But beneath the surface lay a deeper narrative. The airline's employees were starting to examine themselves and their roles within the broader culture of the company. It wasn't a revolution, not yet, but it was something more enduring: reflection. Bethany's reckoning. Bethany sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea untouched beside her. The pages of her employee training manual were spread before her, marked with notes from the cultural sensitivity sessions she'd attended over the past weeks. She hadn't expected the training to affect her so deeply. When it was first mandated, she had approached it with skepticism, even resentment. But now, as she read and reread the materials, something was shifting within her. The exercises had forced her to confront memories she had long ignored, moments when she had treated passengers differently based on nothing more than a hunch or a fleeting judgment. She thought about Serena, about the way she had scrutinized her ticket with a sense of authority that now felt hollow. Bethany had convinced herself she was just doing her job, but the training had shown her how deeply unconscious biases could shape even the most mundane decisions. That evening, Bethany did something she hadn't done in years. She wrote a letter. It wasn't official, nor was it polished. It was personal, a simple note to Serena, apologizing for her actions and acknowledging the harm they had caused. Whether Serena would ever see it, Bethany didn't know, but writing it felt like the first step toward making things right. William's quiet transformation. Across the city, William sat in his study, his uniform jacket draped neatly over the back of a chair. He had spent the day reviewing the company's revised policies on passenger interactions. And for the first time in years, he felt uncertain. The training sessions had left him with more questions than answers, and his usual confidence had been replaced by a lingering doubt. As he reflected on the incident with Serena, William began to see the patterns in his behavior. How he had conflated authority with infallibility. How he had dismissed concerns that didn't align with his worldview. He remembered the slap, the sharp sound of it cutting through the cabin, and the stunned silence that followed. It was a moment he couldn't take back, but it was also a moment that now defined his resolve to change. William had never been one for introspection, but the events of the past weeks had forced him to look inward. For the first time, he found himself questioning not just his actions but the assumptions that had driven them. He didn't know if he could ever undo the harm he had caused, but he was determined to try. Serena's vision. At the airline's headquarters, Serena was meeting with her senior leadership team. The conversation was focused on the future, on the policies and practices that would ensure the company's commitment to equity and respect was more than just a slogan. "We can't just react to incidents like this," Serena said, her voice steady but firm. "We have to prevent them. That means creating a culture where every employee understands the impact of their actions. Not just on the company, but on the people we serve." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her words settling over the group. One of the managers, a middle-aged man with years of experience in the industry, finally spoke up. "It's a tall order," he said. "Changing culture isn't something you can mandate." "I'm not asking for quick fixes," Serena replied. I'm asking for commitment. This isn't just about avoiding lawsuits or bad press. It's about doing what's right. The room nodded in agreement. But Serena could sense the hesitation lingering beneath their acceptance. Change was hard, and it often came at a cost. But Serena was prepared to pay for it. The employees speak. In the weeks that followed, the airline rolled out its new training programs and feedback systems. Employees were encouraged to share their experiences, and the responses were as varied as the people who submitted them. One flight attendant wrote about a moment of realization during a training session. I never thought I treated passengers differently. But now I see how little things, tone of voice, body language can add up. I want to do better. A ground crew member shared a story about witnessing a passenger being treated unfairly. I didn't speak up at the time. And I regret it. This training has shown me that silence can be just as harmful as action. Not every response was positive. Some employees resisted the changes, viewing them as unnecessary or overly critical. But Serena wasn't deterred. She knew that true progress was measured not by unanimous agreement but by the willingness to engage in difficult conversations. Ripples beyond the company. The impact of Serena's efforts began to extend beyond the airline. Passengers who had once felt overlooked or disrespected started to notice a difference. Customer satisfaction scores improved, and the company began receiving letters from travelers who appreciated the changes. One letter, in particular, stood out to Serena. It was from an older woman who had flown with the airline for decades. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't just a number. The letter read, "Your staff treated me with kindness and respect. It's a small thing, but it meant everything to me." Serena folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. It was a reminder of why she had chosen to fight this battle. Not for headlines or accolades, but for the quiet, meaningful moments that made all the difference. As the days turned into weeks, Serena began to see the outlines of a new culture taking shape. It was still fragile, still evolving, but it was real. The employees were learning, the passengers were noticing, and the company was changing. And in the midst of it all, Serena felt a quiet sense of hope. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, she believed it was possible to reach the destination. A pale autumn sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the airline's main conference room. The room was filled with a mix of senior executives, mid-level managers, and employees from every department, each seated in quiet anticipation. Serena Jackson stood at the head of the table, her calm presence commanding attention without the need for raised voices or dramatic gestures. The meeting had been called to discuss the progress of the reform initiatives she had spearheaded. For many, this was a moment of reckoning, a time to confront the tangible outcomes of the changes Serena had implemented and to reflect on the broader implications of their work. A quiet shift in the air. As the meeting began, Serena listened intently to the reports from various departments. One by one, employees shared updates on the new systems and policies. The feedback mechanisms had revealed stories that were both painful and inspiring, accounts of passengers finally feeling seen and heard, alongside admissions from employees who now recognized their own biases. A senior manager stood to present the findings from a recent survey. Customer satisfaction scores have improved significantly, he said, his voice measured but tinged with a sense of pride. But it's not just the numbers. We're hearing from passengers who say they feel more respected and valued. Serena nodded, her gaze steady. And internally, she asked. The manager hesitated before replying. It's a mixed picture. Some employees have embraced the changes, but others are struggling. There's resistance, particularly among those who feel the new policies are too critical of past practices. Serena absorbed the words without reaction. She had expected resistance, change, especially the kind that required people to confront uncomfortable truths, was never easy. Bethany's small steps. At that moment, Bethany sat in the back of the room, her hands folded in her lap. She had been invited to share her reflections, but as the conversation unfolded, she felt a knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. The training sessions had been transformative, forcing her to confront her role in perpetuating biases she hadn't even realized she held. Yet, the idea of standing in front of her colleagues and admitting her mistakes was daunting. When her name was called, Bethany rose slowly, her voice trembling slightly as she began. "I didn't think I'd be here today," she said, glancing around the room. "When all of this started, I was defensive. I didn't believe I'd done anything wrong." She paused, her hands gripping the edge of the podium. "But as I went through the training, I started to see myself more clearly. I saw how my assumptions I didn't even realize I had affected the way I treated passengers. I saw how those small actions, those subtle choices, could leave someone feeling disrespected or unwelcome." Bethany took a deep breath before continuing. "I've learned a lot these past weeks. And I know I still have more to learn. But I want to thank this company for giving me the chance to grow. Even when I didn't think I needed to." The room was silent for a moment before soft applause broke out. Serena watched Bethany closely, noting the humility in her words. It wasn't just a performance, it was a genuine acknowledgement of growth. William's reckoning. In another corner of the room sat William. His usual stoic demeanor slightly softened. He had spent the past weeks grappling with his role in the incident, attending every training session and reflecting deeply on his actions. For a man who had built his career on authority and control, admitting fault was a foreign and deeply unsettling experience. When it was his turn to speak, William stood with a quiet confidence that belied the turmoil he felt inside. "I've been a pilot for over 2 decades," he began, his voice steady. "In that time, I've faced challenges that tested my skills and judgment. But nothing has tested me as much as this." He looked directly at Serena as he spoke. "I owe you an apology, Ms. Jackson, not just for what happened that day, but for the assumptions I made about you, about your intentions, your worth, your place. I let my position blind me to the harm I was causing." William paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "This experience has taught me that leadership isn't about authority. It's about responsibility to listen, to learn, and to treat every person with the respect they deserve." The room remained silent as William returned to his seat. Serena offered him a small nod, her expression one of quiet acknowledgement. She knew the road to redemption was a long one, but this was a step in the right direction. The larger picture. As the meeting continued, Serena guided the discussion toward the broader implications of their work. She spoke about the importance of embedding the values of equity and respect into the company's culture. Not as a one-time initiative but as an ongoing commitment. "This isn't just about fixing what went wrong," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It's about building a foundation for the future. One where every employee, every passenger, feels valued and respected. That's not something we can achieve overnight, but it's something we must strive for every day." The room was quiet as her words sank in. For many, this was the first time they had considered the deeper purpose behind the reforms. It wasn't just about avoiding lawsuits or improving customer satisfaction scores. It was about creating a workplace and a society where dignity and fairness were non-negotiable. Ripples of change. As the meeting adjourned, Serena watched as employees filtered out of the room. Some lingered to discuss the points raised, while others walked away in quiet contemplation. Among them were Bethany and William, their paths crossing briefly as they exited. They exchanged a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the journeys they were both on. Serena stayed behind, gazing out the window at the city below. The work was far from over, but today was a step forward. The ripples of reflection were spreading, touching lives in ways that were both profound and subtle. She thought of the passengers who had written letters, the employees who had shared their stories, and the colleagues who had begun to see themselves more clearly. Change was happening, not in dramatic gestures or sweeping declarations, but in the quiet moments where people choose to confront their own biases and strive for something better. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in shades of amber and gold, Serena felt a quiet sense of hope. The journey was far from over, but the path ahead was clear, and for the first time, she believed they were all moving in the right direction. The mornings had grown colder, the air carrying a crispness that hinted at winter's approach. Serena Jackson sat at her desk, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. The reports from her team were spread before her, each one a testament to the slow but steady progress the airline was making. Complaints had decreased, customer satisfaction had risen, and employees were beginning to embrace the cultural awareness training that had once been met with skepticism. But Serena knew better than to rest on these victories. Change, she had learned, was not a straight line. It was a series of moments, some forward, some backward, that required patience and vigilance. As she reviewed the latest data, she reflected on how far they had come and how much further they still had to go. Bethany's quiet redemption. Bethany's day began as usual, with the familiar routines of preparing the first-class cabin. But something about her demeanor had shifted. She moved with a quieter confidence now. Her interactions with passengers more thoughtful. Her tone more measured. That morning, as she welcomed passengers aboard, she noticed a woman in her 60s struggling with a piece of luggage. Without hesitation, Bethany stepped forward to assist. Her smile genuine. "Let me help you with that," she said, lifting the bag into the overhead compartment. The woman thanked her, and for a moment, their eyes met. It was a simple interaction, but Bethany felt its weight. She had once overlooked gestures like these, seeing them as mere tasks. Now, she understood their importance. The small acts of kindness that could transform a passenger's experience. Later, during the flight, Bethany noticed a black couple seated in first class. They were dressed modestly, their demeanor quiet yet dignified. For a brief moment, Bethany felt a pang of discomfort, a reminder of the assumptions she might have made in the past. But this time, she chose differently. She approached them with the same warmth she extended to every passenger, offering them drinks and ensuring their comfort. As she walked away, she overheard the woman say to her husband, "She's so kind." The words stayed with Bethany for the rest of the day. They were a reminder that the changes she was making, however small, were beginning to take root. William's journey. For William, the process of change had been slower, more introspective. As a pilot, he had always seen himself as separate from the interpersonal dynamics of the cabin. His job, he believed, was to focus on safety and efficiency. But the events of the past weeks had forced him to reconsider his role, not just as a pilot, but as a leader. One evening, after completing a flight, William sat down with a group of young pilots during a training session. The topic was cultural awareness, and William had been asked to share his perspective. "At first, I didn't think this kind of training was necessary," he admitted, his voice steady but reflective. "I thought being a good pilot was enough. But I've realized that leadership is about more than technical skills. It's about how we treat people. Our passengers, our colleagues, and everyone we encounter." He paused, looking around the room. "I made a mistake, a serious one, and I'm not proud of it. But what I've learned is that acknowledging our mistakes is the first step toward becoming better. I hope you'll take that lesson to heart." The young pilots listened intently, their respect for William evident in their expressions. For the first time in his career, William felt that his words carried weight. Not because of his position, but because of his willingness to admit his humanity. Passengers speak out. As the airline's culture began to shift, passengers started to notice the difference. Letters and emails poured in, many of them expressing gratitude for the changes. One letter, written by an elderly black man, caught Serena's attention. "I've flown with your airline for years," he wrote. "There were times when I felt invisible, as though my presence in first class was an anomaly. But on my last flight, something was different. The staff treated me with respect. Not as a favor, but as if it was simply the right thing to do. Thank you for making me feel seen." Serena folded the letter carefully, her heart heavy with a mixture of pride and sorrow. For every passenger who felt valued, there were likely others who had yet to experience the change. But she took solace in knowing they were moving in the right direction. The community takes notice. The ripple effects of the airline's reforms extended beyond its flights. Word of Serena's efforts began to spread, drawing attention from advocacy groups and industry leaders. Invitations to speak at conferences and panels poured in, each one an opportunity to share the lessons she had learned. At one such event, held in a modest community center, Serena stood before a diverse audience of professionals, activists, and community members. She spoke not of her personal accomplishments, but of the collective effort required to dismantle systemic bias. "Change doesn't happen in a vacuum," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "It requires all of us to examine our actions, our assumptions, and the systems we operate within. It's not easy, and it's not quick, but it's necessary. Afterward, an elderly woman approached her, her eyes bright with emotion. Thank you, she said, for reminding us that it's never too late to do the right thing. The seeds of progress. As the weeks turned into months, Serena began to see the outlines of a new culture taking shape within the airline. Employees like Bethany and William were not just following new policies, they were embodying the values those policies represented. Passengers were beginning to feel the difference, their letters and feedback a testament to the power of small but meaningful actions. Yet Serena knew the work was far from over. There were still challenges to face, still biases to confront, but she believed in the progress they had made, and in the potential for even greater change. One evening, as she left the office, Serena paused to watch the city lights twinkling in the distance. The world was vast and complex, its problems deeply rooted and often overwhelming. But in that moment, she felt a quiet sense of hope. Change, she realized, wasn't about grand gestures or instant results. It was about the steady, patient work of planting seeds that, over time, could grow into something enduring and profound. The days had grown shorter, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the city. Serena Jackson sat alone in a quiet corner of the airport lounge, watching the rhythmic movement of planes on the tarmac. The past months had been some of the most challenging of her life, but they had also been some of the most meaningful. As she reflected on the journey, she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The work wasn't finished, perhaps it never would be, but the foundation had been laid. The meeting that changed everything. That morning, Serena had attended a final review meeting with her leadership team. The agenda was clear: to evaluate the progress of the reforms and to chart the path forward. The room had been filled with a sense of accomplishment, tempered by the knowledge that change was a continuous process. A senior manager presented the latest data: improved customer satisfaction, reduced complaints, and a noticeable shift in employee engagement. "We're seeing real results," he said, his voice steady but cautious. "But there's still work to do." Serena nodded. "There always will be. This isn't about reaching a finish line. It's about building a culture that evolves with the people it serves." As the meeting drew to a close, Serena stood to address the room. Her tone was calm, measured, but resolute. "I want to thank each of you for your commitment to this process. What we've achieved is significant, but it's only the beginning. The true test will be in how we sustain this progress, not through policies alone, but through the actions we take every day." The room erupted in quiet applause, not out of formality, but out of genuine respect for the woman who had guided them through this transformation. Bethany and William's next steps. Among those who had come the furthest were Bethany and William. Their journeys had been difficult, marked by moments of resistance and self-doubt, but they had emerged changed. Bethany had taken on a new role as a mentor for junior flight attendants, sharing her experiences and encouraging them to approach their work with empathy and openness. One afternoon, as she prepared for a flight, a young attendant approached her with a question about a passenger who had made a complaint. "What should I do?" the attendant asked, her voice uncertain. Bethany smiled, her tone warm but firm. "Start by listening. Really listening. Sometimes, that's all people need." Meanwhile, William had become an advocate for the airline's cultural awareness initiatives. During a recent training session, he shared his story with a group of new pilots, emphasizing the importance of humility and respect. "Leadership isn't about being right," he told them. "It's about being willing to learn, even when it's uncomfortable." A letter from the past. One day, Serena received a letter from a passenger she had met years ago, long before the incident that had sparked this journey. The letter was handwritten, its tone thoughtful and reflective. "Dear Ms. Jackson, I flew with your airline many years ago. At the time, I felt invisible, just another face in the crowd. But on my last flight, something was different. The staff treated me with kindness and respect, and I saw passengers of all backgrounds being treated the same. I don't know what changed, but I wanted to thank you. It reminded me that dignity isn't a privilege, it's a right." Serena read the letter twice, her emotions a mixture of pride and resolve. It was a reminder of why she had fought so hard. For the passengers who had felt unseen. For the employees who needed to grow. And for the future they were building together. A new perspective. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Serena left the airport lounge and walked toward the terminal. Her flight wasn't for another few hours. But she enjoyed the quiet rhythm of the airport. The ebb and flow of travelers moving toward their destinations. She paused at a window, watching a plane taxi down the runway. In its movement, she saw a metaphor for her journey. Change, like flight, required careful preparation, constant adjustments, and the courage to trust in the process. A nearby gate agent caught her eye. The woman was assisting an elderly couple. Her demeanor patient and kind. Serena smiled, recognizing the subtle but profound impact of the cultural shift within the airline. These moments, quiet, unassuming, yet deeply meaningful, were the true measure of their success. The horizon ahead. Later that evening, as Serena boarded her flight, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. The cabin crew greeted her warmly, their smiles genuine, their interactions seamless. She took her seat by the window and gazed out at the darkening sky. As the plane lifted off, Serena watched the city lights fade into the distance. The journey ahead was long, the destination uncertain, but she knew she wasn't alone. The work they had done. The seeds they had planted would continue to grow, carried forward by the people who believed in the values of respect, empathy, and justice. And in that quiet moment, Serena felt a renewed sense of purpose. The horizon stretched before her, vast and open, a reminder of all that was possible when people chose to rise above their differences and strive for something better.